Despite his many, many challenges in Lavan's home, Yaakov comes back to Eretz Yisrael. The Torah says, Shalom, whole. And that's a message for all of us, that we will be whole despite the golus. Ofen Pasuk, Vayova Yaakov Shalom Ir Shechem. The Torah tells us that Yaakov came whole to the city of Shechem. Zon Chazal and Gemara, the Gemara Shabbos tells us, Rashi brings us up, if Yerush al Torah, Rashi quotes it too. Shalom meant that Shalom, complete, means three areas. Shalom begufa, he was completely healthy. Shalom b'mamoinoi, his money was all intact, his wealth was intact. Shalom b'teirasai, he was whole in his Torah. Now, the Zogan for Shalom begufa, Shalom b'mamoinoi is noted k'meferish b'medrash. Why do you have to tell me that he is healthy and that he has all his wealth? Medrash tells you why. Shalom begufa, because remember, he had been attacked and injured by Esav's malach, so he was limping at some point, and now he was healed. Shalom b'mamoinoi. Why do we have to know that he was whole in his wealth? Because because the Medrash says that he spent 9 years giving gifts to Esav, which is a lot of money. But there state in Rashi al Torah, Rashi says something similar. That his health was restored after having limped, being attacked by the malach, and that he had his wealth intact because he wasn't net negative even after he gave this incredible gift to Esav. So that makes sense. But the Medrash doesn't tell us what it means that he's Shalom b'Teirasai. Rashi does. The only thing is, Rashi says it in two different places, the Gemara Shabbos and Rashi on the Pasuk, and he gives us two different explanations. So in Rashi Kvinmen, in the Mastira, Rashi actually seems to give contradictory insights. When Rashi is commenting the Gemara in Shabbos, says the Mefarish, he explains what does it mean Shalom b'Teirasai? That despite the fact he was traveling so much and it was difficult with his big family, etc., he didn't forget any of his learning. Whereas his commentary on Chumash, he says that Rashi did not forget any Torah in Lavan's home. We have to understand. What's the time? Why does Rashi give us two different explanations? Why? Not only that, Nochme. Once Rashi did give us two explanations, it would appear that he gave the one that's closer to Pshat in the Gemara and the one that's further from Pshat in his commentary on the Chumash. But Rashi is my first Pshuta Yishon Mikra, where Rashi in Chumash is explaining the simple understanding of the Psukim. Voltmer Matim, given to Zogan Dafkid and Pirush Alashas, surely would have made more sense to say what he said in the Gemara. He didn't forget his learning despite the travails of travel. Not the fact that he didn't forget his learning in Lavan's house. Why? One of the pasuk zogdach, because look what the pasuk is telling us. Vayovoi Yaakov Shalom Ir Shechem. That Yaakov came to Shechem whole. So logically, the fact that he's whole, which is surprising, is obviously related to the fact that he's now arriving in Shechem, which means that the issues were on the journey, surely. In Medrash state, as Yaakov is gleich ausgeheilt geworden mit Zal Osai, durch Vayishlach lo Hashemesh, the Medrash actually says that Yaakov's healing from the limp was immediate. As the pasuk says, that the sun rose and he was healed. And with regards to the money he spent on Esav's gift, the Medrash also says that the Eibush immediately compensated him for it. Which means from the Medrash perspective, Yaakov had already regained his health and his money when he got to Sukkot, which is long before Shechem, at least 18 months before he got to Shechem, right? 6 months in Sukkot, 6 months in Batim, as Rashi explains. But that's a Medrash. But if you look at Pshat, it's also alts given in an Ofen Tivi. You assume that his healing was natural and took time, and his recouping his finances was natural and took time. Side if Reform Mitzal Osoi, on side dem Lechasonim B'Mamoinoi. Und das ist der Aufruf von dem Pasuk Vayova Yaakov Shalom Ir Shechem. That's what the pasuk's telling us, the surprise that Yaakov comes whole to Shechem. As Kuvendik in Shechem is given Shalom, that when he got to Shechem, he was whole. Why is that so surprising? Because if you follow the natural process, Rashi is saying, this is what the Torah wants us to know. It took that long until he got to Shechem that he was fully healed from the limp. Und sie ist nicht mal geworden durch Paris für Rabbis von seinen Zähnen. And all of the money he expended on the gifts to Esav were now finally replaced because his flocks had children. Going back to our question on Rashi, it would make sense when Rashi tells us that the issue is he was Shalom B'Terasa despite the journey he had been on. That makes sense. Now he gets to Shem, where he's now going to settle for a decent period of time. As the Pasuk tells us, he purchases land. Is it given? Now you can tell us he's whole in his Torah. Despite the fact that he's been on a very difficult journey, which took him all the time to get to Shem. But the opinion Rashi is quoting when he comments on Chumash, which is that Shalom means he never forgot any of his learning while in Lavan's house. Then the Shalom is not relative to arriving in Shem. It had happened long before. The Shalom is given by Mavegen from Beis Lavan. That wholeness was already present when he left Lavan's home long ago. So why then Rashi, whose objective is to tell us the simplest understanding of the pasuk, why then does he say over here that Yaakov is complete in his Torah because he didn't forget anything in Lavan's house? How does that come to be here? Says Nikin Kash, it's not a question. How you can even suggest such a thing? That he didn't forget his learning in Lavan's house. So don't say, why are you talking about that he didn't lose his learning in Lavan's house and now you're only describing it when he gets to Shem? Well, you could say, in Pasuk steht doch nicht Shalom nor b'teirasei, no Shalom stam. That's because the Pasuk of it is not only talking about his Torah learning list. The Pasuk is talking about all the various elements that he all the various elements that he needed in order to be whole. So the pasuk would make perfect sense. Even if his Torah was intact already long before, we're only going to apply the term shalom now because now all three things are intact. Because the Torah was already healthy long before. The Shaila is, but what is, however, question? Because as Rashi says in the Gemara, there is a possible explanation why are we surprised that Yaakov is whole in his Torah? Because he was on such a difficult journey. So why does Rashi choose, and specifically in his Pirush on Torah, which is Pshat, when Yaakov is given Beis Lavan, specifically the fact that Yaakov in Lavan's house retained his Torah, when there was an easier way to explain it. There's something else we have to understand, and that is that there's a medrash that offers a fourth area where it was surprisingly so that Yaakov came sholem. In medrash, when it brings to Zichaferte Zachim, Yaakov is given sholem, the medrash quotes another, and it's actually quite an important area where Yaakov was whole, and that is sholem b'banav. His family was whole. So because he was afraid of Esav's attack and he divided his family in case chas v'sholem he'd lose some of them, so therefore the Torah is to say that didn't happen, the threat never materialized, and he is whole in his family. So isn't it moving? Also doesn't make sense. Surely Rashi, who's looking at the pshat of the psukim, should have identified this point, that is shalom b'banav, that his family is whole. Because it's not only saying you need a medrash in order to think about it. We know the story. We know there was a threat hanging over his family, and that threat never materialized. Say shalom b'banav. So why does Rashi specifically quote the Gemara that only gives three areas where Yaakov arrived whole and doesn't say anything about the family, even though there's a medrash to that effect? The Tmiya is noch gresser. You know what really makes this astounding? Is that Rashi actually spoke about this issue and addressed it with Avram Avinu. In Parashas Lech Lecha, in Avram, the beginning of Parashas Lech Lecha, you have the Eibishter's promise to Avram Avinu, which is, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Is Rashi meforish? Rashi is the one who says, because the travel affects three areas of life. One of them is mema'et es periverivia. It affects a person's ability to establish a family. As well as it affects a person's finances and their reputation. Therefore, says Rashi, therefore, Rashi says the Eibishter had given these three special brachas. The first one is that his family should be intact. Zet man as a bracha b'kesher lebanim is an ikri. So firstly, that shows you that having a bracha for your family to survive the travails of journeying is fundamental. And not only that, and when do we address it? When we think it could be negatively affected, which is when you travel. So Yaakov Avinu is traveling. We should be concerned about the well-being of his family. The fact that his family turns out okay should be recognized. Shonim b'bonav. And it's Rashi who brought up this issue. So in the pasuk that says that Yaakov arrives safely after his journey and whole, surely Rashi should have included the fact that his family is intact in his explanation. To answer all of this, we have to ask a very glaring question. Let's first address a general question about Rashi. When you read the pasuk that Yaakov arrived in Shem whole, when you've read the story of how he escaped the clutches of Esav more than once, how he escaped all the shenanigans of Lavan more than once, as the Ikar appears from Vayova Yaakov Shalom is bepashas. Surely you would conclude that when the Torah tells us that Yaakov gets to the other side whole, it means simply he wasn't harmed by those people. Is angekommen ganz unbeschädigt von Lavan und Esav. That it means he arrived whole, unscathed by Esav and Lavan with all their malevolent intentions. As Rashi immediately says in Adibra Maschel Achreze, in one of the next Rashis, when he came from Padan Aram, it's in the same pasuk. Rashi says it's like a person who says to his friend, this person escaped the jaws of the lion and he came home whole. Avkan, likewise, that he escaped the malintentions of Esav and Lavan. And yet, despite that being the most obvious interpretation of Yaakov arriving whole, Rashi doesn't say it. Rather, in his interpretation, which is Pshat, he says, Shalom does not mean in relative to the extreme danger of Esav and Lavan. No, it's something much more generic. That is, money was intact, his health was intact. I mean, health, you talk about life and death, you talk about his health, that he's not limping anymore. His Torah is intact. Especially with when the pshat are you going to even see this in the pasuk. And specifically, the way Rashi is interpreting that his body is healthy is not that he wasn't killed, which was the big threat, but that he wasn't limping. Is from the Pirish, from the Mlashon Shalom. Now you might want to say, well, you've got to analyze the word Shalom. Shalom, complete, means that something was lacking and now it's no longer lacking. So maybe you'd say, listen, the word Shalom leads us to think this way because Shalom implies something was lacking and now it's no longer lacking. Well, first of all, Rashi himself says differently. Rashi says it's like the person who said so-and-so came out whole after escaping the jaws of the lion. But the truth is, even this Pirush Rashi explains that it's not that way. Rashi says completion with regards to Torah is he never forgot the Torah in the first place. Not that he forgot and it was filled, he remembered it all again afterwards. He never forgot it. There was no chesaron in the first place. That meant, as the failures by him can chesaron need given, that even though practically what we're saying is that Yaakov comes out without lacking anything, you can say the term sholem, even not when there was actual lack, but when there was the potential of a lack. You could say the same thing then, being saved from Esav and Lavan. There was the potential of a loss, and it never happened. So that's not an explanation, which means we're back to our original question. Why is Rashi not addressing the most obvious thing, which is Sholem means he was not harmed by Esav and Lavan? Shlem Habir Bozet, explanation is this. See, sometimes if you've been given a promise by the Eibishter, surely then you're not surprised when it's fulfilled. And immediately as Yaakov went on his journey, the Eibishter promised him long before he got to Lavan, I'm with you, and I will guard you, I will look after you wherever you go. You take that at face value, which is what Pshat is, which the level at which Rashi comments. What it means is Tishmira from Esav and Lavan. That the Eibishter is promising Yaakov, Esav and Lavan will not harm you. The Rashi is not meforish. And Rashi explains it right there. He says, because that's what Yaakov was afraid of. So the Eibishter reassures him they can't touch you. Over Mele. So if the Eibishter promises that Yaakov and Lavan are not going to harm you, we don't need another pasuk later after the story to tell us, see, it happened. As Yaakov is angekommen Shalom von Esav and Lavan, that Yaakov walked out unscathed. That goes without saying. It was a promise from the Eibishter. It happened. You have precedent in the case of Avram Avinu. There were promises that the Eibishter made to Avram Avinu when he set out on his journey at the beginning of Lech Lecha. That you'll be a great nation, that you won't have all the tzoros of the derech. As a tiltal derech wird bei ihm nicht memeit sein von die shloisha devarim. That the journeys he'll go on will not take away from having children or wealth or reputation. So gefindt man nicht, as the pasuk soll ergens madgish sein as kachave. There's no pasuk that says, and the promise was fulfilled. Vayov Avram sholem v'chayotzev hazeh. That Avram came complete. So, pasuk by Yaakov, and why is the pasuk saying by Yaakov that he came out sholem? If the Eibishter promised him he's going to be okay, surely he's going to be okay. Therefore Rashi has to say that okay we're referring to over here is not safety. The kind of wholeness we're describing over here is not the wholeness promised by the Eibishter to Yaakov. That I'll be with you and I'll protect you. Nor, rather, the shalom over here refers to very unique situations which could have caused Yaakov not to be whole, despite the Eibishter's problems. And despite that, none of those things harmed him. Now, what things could potentially threaten Yaakov Avinu if he has the Eibishter's overarching promise, I'll protect you? On the phone, was the pasuk sagt Shalom stam is muchach. The fact that the pasuk doesn't tell us, and it just says he came Shalom, whole, that proves as das given nit nor in ein prat, that it wasn't just one area that Yaakov was whole. Now Shalom kipshutin alle seine pratim, rather it means that Yaakov is whole in every sphere. On das seine die drei Jahren was Rashi rechnet ois. Which spheres? Rashi will tell us. Shalom begufoi shenisrapi mitzal ose. Let's first talk about the fact that he was limping, and you have to think how he got to be limping, and then you'll appreciate why it's a chiddush that limp was healed. Das was Yaakov is given zu Lea al Yerecha is given at Titzof and Zamilchama Mitzara Shel Esav. As we well know, the reason Yaakov Avinu was limping was because he had a wrestling match with the archangel of Esav, a malach, which means Ashliach von Eibishter. The Eibishter must have sent him. A malach doesn't operate independently. If the malach came to wrestle Esav, it means it was sent by the Eibishter. Und bald, als das seinen was ist getan geworden zu Yaakov meizetam shehu durch hamalach shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because this is something that happened to Yaakov, we don't know why, but directed from Hashem, is moving, as das hat nichts zu tun mit dem, was wird bewohnt in der Avtachos Shmaticha von Esav and Lavan. So then, the fact that the Eibishter promised Yaakov protection from Esav and Lavan has no bearing on this story. This is the Eibishter sending this malach to fight against him. Where's the protection? There's no guarantee of protection here. So therefore, if the malach hurts him, maybe it's going to be lasting. And the fact that he was whole in his finances despite the gift that he gave to Esav. Let's be honest. After whatever amount of gift Yaakov gave to Esav, Yaakov remained an extremely wealthy man. And you can see that in the Pesukim. Over Mele, I feel when by Yaakov involved nicht nismalig geworden durch Sarah Nadoren. So therefore, even if Yaakov never recouped the money or the gifts that he gave to Esav, so what is noch nicht geminnet in einem Kim Aftachas HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ushmarticho Gomer LeEzavcha Gomer. It wouldn't have undermined Abish's promise to protect him. He had more wealth than he could ever use. Was meant as wird haben lechem lechel Gomer. He said, I want to have food for my family. He has food and some. Von deswegen hat ihm David dem Male given dem ganzen Chesar Mikol Eisedoren. So despite the fact that he didn't need the bracha of Shalem in that context, because he had more than sufficient, still the Chiddush is the Eibishter gave him Shalem. Whatever he paid out to Esav came back to him. Shalem b'terasa shlei shachach Talmud beveis Lavan, and on a similar theme, the idea that he was whole in his Torah and didn't forget any of his learning in Beis Lavan. Then it says, Mokum as Yaakov soll vergessen Talmud beveis Lavan. Why do you think Yaakov might have forgotten his Torah in Beis Lavan? Well, you know why? Because he had responsibilities there. Al pi haloche. It's nicht der Wirkung von Yaakov sein zusammen mit Lavan Arash. It's not because he was in a toxic environment in Lavan's home. If dem hat Yaakov gebeten b'shafti b'sholem, that's something that Yaakov already dealt with before he went down. He said, please let me come back peacefully. Sholem minachet. Let me be protected from sin. Shalo almad midarkei Lavan. That I shouldn't learn from the bad ways of Lavan. That's part of the promise. And that was fulfilled. And Yaakov even told Esav, as Rashi tells us, that I spent all of this time with Lavan and I still kept every one of the 613 mitzvahs and I did not learn from him. I was not influenced. That's part of the Shmarticha. That's part of the promise. So why is there concern that Yaakov might have forgotten his learning? Yaakov is in Beis Lavan given fanum mit grois gegeben kalt zu sein Arbeit als Reitzain. Because Yaakov Avinu was completely overly dedicated to his job as Lavan's shepherd. And that's a requirement al pi Torah. In fact, he says that I served Lavan with all of my strength. I was in the cold of the night and the heat of the day, and I didn't sleep. He did this for 20 consecutive years. Es wahrscheinlich der Chiddush achi gadol, as nicht geguckt auf dem Malem, is leishachach Talmud beveis Lavan, and you can imagine what an incredible surprise it is that despite all of that appropriate investment, he doesn't forget one bit of his Torah learning. So all three examples are things where you believe that despite Hashem's promises, maybe he'd be losing a little bit. The Eibishter's malach should have an effect. He could still be wealthy without getting his money back from Esav. He was dedicated al pi halacha to his work, and therefore it might have cost him some of his learning. But none of this falls under the promise that the Eibishter gave him that I'll protect you wherever you go. Warum? Let's assume for a moment that Yaakov was back home in Eretz Canaan, and he was a shepherd, and he was working the same. He'd also need a bracha not to forget his learning. That's not something because of his circumstances, because of his location. And that's what we're saying over here. The uniqueness of the bracha that Yaakov Avinu had is that he did not forget his Torah learning, even in Lavan's house, because he was so dedicated over there. And with that, we can immediately resolve the questions we had about Rashi. Rashi cannot bring in dominion from Shalom B'Banav. In this context, Shalom B'Banav doesn't apply. As Esav Hadniki can't only in Banav Sheyakim, Yava Esav Gomer. What's his fear? That Esav's going to hurt his children? It's part of the promise. That's part of the promise that the Eibishter says, I'm going to protect you. And the pasuk darf es nicht erzählen kann, also the pasuk doesn't have to tell us that the Eibishter did protect him. Ken Rashi nit mefarz sein befirush ala Torah, as shalom b'terase mein shalei shachach tamud mipnei terech haderech. Likewise, for the same reason, Rashi cannot interpret that Yaakov, the chiddush that he retained his Torah, is despite traveling. Traveling's got nothing to do with it. Because the Eibishter promised him protection while he's traveling. I'll guard you, I'll secure you when you're traveling. Secure means I'll keep your Torah learning as well. As der Eibishter wird im Hitten von jedem innen Bild die Rotze, was die Aliche, Keil, den Tilter, Haderech, can Geirem sein. That means that the Eibishter is going to protect him from anything that the travel could do negatively, including distraction or making him forget his Torah. As he says, I want you to guard me, Yaakov asked the Eibishter, I want you to guard me on the whole path that I go. Al derech brichas HaKadosh Baruch Hu LaAvram, and that's very similar to the bracha that the Eibishter gave Avram Avinu, as ein tiltel haderech vet beim nit mehr mait sein von die shloisha dvarim, that despite the very difficult journeys they'd have to undergo, it wouldn't diminish the three areas that are typically diminished through travel. So what do we learn from this? Let's first take the spiritual perspective, and then from that we can learn what it means. As the aluche von Yaakov and Kenchon is merabes if alichas bon of Bnei Yisrael, ma'asav similar bonim in golus. As we said, Yaakov going into a terrible place like Haran is symbolic of the Jewish people going into golus. Sagt der Pasuk, Yaakov shalim Yishrem asher beretz Canaan bevoy mipadan Aram. So the Pasuk tells us that Yaakov came whole to Shechem, which is in Eretz Canaan, when he came back from Padan Aram. Debish is maftiach yed Eden as a vetzachum keren shalom ganze heit from golus. In that message, the Eibishter is telling every Jew, you will come back from golus whole. Is Rashi mevorim moisef? So Rashi explains, and he adds insight. As dos es loven and be'esav ken mitzad atzmon nit onrin na Eden on Yaakov kumt aus shalom ken Eretz Yisrael. The fact that the fact that the Esavs and Lavans of the world cannot harm us, and the fact that we will always emerge unscathed, that goes without saying. That's not the insight being shared in this particular moment when Yaakov arrives whole in Shechem. That's something the Eibishter promised and guaranteed us long before we went into golus. I'll be with you, I'll protect you. Nobody has power to harm a Jew. The Chiddush is, this part of the story tells us more than that. As I feel in there are other areas where, based on the design of how the Eibishter made the world, and included in that is that he made golus, as golus or pearls in Eden. The Eibishter designed it that there's certain areas where golus could potentially affect us. That's the plan. To the extent that we could actually land up losing something. Even there, sagt der Pasuk bei Yaakov Sholem, as the Chesron is nikan emeser. There the Torah says, yes, there may be moments of loss, but they're temporary. They're not real. It says, it's just a temporary measure. Eventually the Chesron will be replenished, and eventually will be whole. Rashi addresses three areas. Those three areas are directly relevant to us in our golus experience. The first one, he says, that what happened was that he came back, Yaakov came healthy, his limp was healed. One of the big assets that Jews have during golus is that we serve the Eibishter with Mesiras Nefesh. That's why we have challenges through the period of golus, and some of them are painful challenges, but they're tests. That the Eibishter is testing us. We also know that Manasseh means to elevate us, and the pasuk continues Ladas, to help us have true understanding of the Eibishter. The pressure cooker of golus is to elicit Mesiras Nefesh out of Eden. That's why Esav's guardian angel attacks Yaakov's thigh. The Ramban quotes the Medrash and explains that it means the Medrash says that this means that Esav's malach tried to cheper with all the tzaddikim that would come from Yaakov in the future. Says the Ramban, that means Zed Darish Shmad. This refers to the generations that would be given those horrific choices to give up their lives for their Judaism. In other words, as das der Remes of the Yisra Golus biz in the Rachmanitzan Shversten Oifen, which implies that the attack on Yaakov is representative of the attacks on Jewish people through Golus, and the worst kinds of attacks, the worst kinds of pressure and tests. The purpose of all of that pressure and all of that assault is to bring out of us Mesiras Nefesh. Chemikas for Shalom maintenance, a person could think, as we Baldis, not from Esav and Lamata, not from Sorry Shal Esav, that all of the anti-Semitism and all of the mistreatment of Jewish people throughout history is not of their doing. It's directed by the so-called Sorry Shal Esav, meaning on Hashem's orders. That they're directed from on high in order to squeeze out of us this sacrifice and dedication. So you could think, okay, it's real. Something the Eibush is doing, it's real. If it's real, it's lasting. If them come to Bavarnish, therefore the Torah tell us no shalom that Yaakov is whole and healthy, his limp is removed. After we've done the avodah we have to do in golus, when the Yisraelim ganzen bottle, all of the difficulty and pain that got us to that avodah disappears. The limp is healed to the extent that we are considered absolutely whole. The reason is because it was never real to start with. Now, purely it was the Eibish's test. It's a virtual reality that is very compelling. It's the Eibish's test to bring out our Mesiras Nefesh, and then it disappears. Next lesson. And then Yaakov is whole in his wealth, because even though he gave tremendous gifts to Esav, none of it detracted from his wealth. The tachlis from golus is nit nora as the id allein soll der funaris kommen ganz v'shalom. The goal of golus is not just as we as individuals get through on the other side, whole Jews, committed Jews. Nor as alle chiber machen die Inyolim von golus und sie machen mamoyne mahavach seine kedusha. But the goal is to turn the world around. The goal is to cause the world to become our asset, meaning a holy asset. And that's what Yaakov's story was. Not only was he personally and his family personally saved from Lavan and Esav, he took so much of Lavan's assets that later Lavan says, everything you see here was mine. And not only does Yaakov take all of this wealth of Lavan and elevate it to Kedusha, but he affects Esav to switch Esav around. That the same Esav who once upon a time was willing to murder him, Esav runs to him with enthusiasm and he hugs and he kisses him. To the extent that Rabbi Shimon says it was genuine, it was sincere. Despite the fact that it's a well-known fact, even brought in halacha, that Esav hates Yaakov, here was suspended and transformed. That prepares us for the time of Moshiach, when there will be saviors in the world of Esav, and the Eibush will be renowned and accepted as the king over the whole world. It's not just that we're going to judge Esav. It's that the Eibush is going to be recognized as the ruler of the world, which means Esav will recognize the Eibush. Sapcha. As the Rambam describes part of the job description of Mashiach, that Mashiach will rehabilitate the whole world to serve the Eibush in unison. As the pasuk says, that the Eibush will change the language of the whole world to serve the Eibush together. How did Yaakov do it? How did Yaakov pivot Esav? First he davened, obviously for help, then he sent him a gift. The same applies to every Jew. In order to transform the Esavs of the world, the golus of the world. First you got to daven to the Eibush for success. And then you have to give some of your wealth. You've got to invest in the world. You've got to buy the things with which we do mitzvahs, or with which we elevate gashmis. And we have to give time. You got to go out there. You got to actually work, which consumes a lot of time. Time that should have been dedicated to Torah learning. And therefore the Gemara asks the question, what's going to happen to our Torah learning? Because if we're so busy in the fields, what's going to happen to Torah? So Mavar sein die Welt of why are we doing all of these things? To be able to refine and transform the world. Das heißt, lässt sich herab im Welt und vernimmt sich mit Inyanim Gashmi Chrisha Chulei. That means that a person allows themselves to enter the mundane physical reality and engages with physical activities. As we say in the language of Chassidus, sometimes you have to wear the clothing of the one you wish to rehabilitate in order to have an effect on the world. So the bike can very nice shine, and then you'll ask a question. This is different to the Mesiras Nefesh. Mesiras Nefesh was just a test. You pass the test, we remove the problem. This is not the same. Where the actual test was made up of things that are virtual. Now, here we're actually refining a world that they created that is real. If and we want to transform that world, so if I want to do this, it's going to cost me. I actually have to give up real time. I have to give up real assets to be able to affect the world. More than that. That means that the time and energy that I invest in the physical world to try and transform it is real. Can never get that time back, can never get that energy back. So therefore the Torah says, you know what? Even though you really are giving up your time, you really are giving up your opportunity to learn Torah, etc., even that, the fact that you're feeling a loss is temporary. Because in Sof Sofer Ta'id, because at the end, you will not land up losing. Because when we go to greet Mashiach, we're going to bring with all of the investment that we made. And it will all be whole, because it will now all be part of the world of Kedusha. It won't be a loss for a later gain, it will be part of the achievement. And then lastly, the last message is, you don't lose your Torah when you're working in Beis Lavan. The Indian from Talmud Torah b'shlemus that precious from Velt. If you really want to learn Torah properly, you have to step out of the world. It's the only way to be able to focus without distraction. And that's what Yaakov did. Yaakov spent his whole life learning. Where? In the tents, away from the fields. And spent 14 years hidden in Aver's yeshiva. So a person's going to complain. You expect me to go out into the physical world. You expect me to elevate the world. How do you expect me to maintain my elevated, or expected to be elevated level of Torah learning if I'm out there, I'm running a business? So therefore the Torah tells us, even in the house of Lavan, Yaakov did not lose any of his Torah. But the first two examples we said, listen, it's possible that a person temporarily loses their health until the nisayon is over. And it's possible that a person could lose money in the investment in doing things that are for the purpose of birur hanitzaitis. But don't worry, at the end everything will come right and all the gaps will be filled. But when it comes to Torah learning, we see that Yaakov never has a moment of losing his Torah. Not that in Beis Lavan he lost his Torah and then afterwards was compensated. No, even in Beis Lavan he didn't learn his Torah. Warum? The reason is, like the Frierdiker says, only the human body was taken into golus. But our neshamas were never snatched into the golus and never handed over to the subjugation. It's the kavanah that means it's the kavanah in them. Need no kipashas haloshen in a movement from golus kipshutai. That doesn't only mean the actual golus as we always understand it, as malchus avaniken shlitay fan neshama. That obviously the nations of the world have no jurisdiction over our neshamas. That goes without saying. Now, nachmer, it's beyond that. As ich der avoide mit golus wird nicht an die primus neshama, was is hecher von golus, even the avoide that we do that requires engagement with golus, that avoide doesn't harm the inner part of our neshama. Die Rede von dem Adam in golus zum Avara sein, the golus is bloß negate chitzenes neshama. The only part of my neshama that gets engaged in the golus world in order to affect the world is the most superficial part of my neshama. Aber in the neshama atzma, wach is in golus nicht vertrieben is nicht ken Yiride chas v'sholem. But the real neshama never entered golus Not only is it not affected by the external golus, it's not even affected by the time I have to spend in golus. On the Rebbe Shachach Talmud bebeis Lavan, therefore Yaakov Avinu did not forget any Torah, even in Lavan's house. The Torah was Yaakov had gelernt, seindig nicht mehr befrischtes vom Welt, ist beim geblieben ganz eich bebeis Lavan. That Torah which he learned while he was separated from the world, hidden away in yeshivas, that did not disappear even when he was in Lavan's home. The stories of our forefathers are indicators and resources for us. And every one of us carries the empowerment of Yaakov. Not only will we be okay on the other end when golus ends, but even when we're in golus, in Beis Lavan, I could be in Lavan's house and at a level where my Torah is intact. My spirituality remains absolutely whole, as Yaakov Avinu's Torah remained absolutely whole. And with Hashem, as a result of that, we'll be able to immediately go to greet Mashiach Shelemim in every respect.